Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of 2022's Bookstore Romance Day. I'm Olivia Waite. I'm going to be your moderator. This panel is on faith and romance and religious traditions, and we are very excited about this today. We've got a great lineup for you, and we also have a 45-minute quick conversation turnaround, so let's just jump in and get this started. Rosie, would you please? Okay, is there feedback somewhere? Is that from me?
Okay. Oh, I think it's okay. Maybe okay now.
Are we all?
Oh, Farah, you're
doing
fine.
it for everybody?
No, it
was just Rosie. Oh no.
Yeah. Oh, that's not good. Does someone else want to go first? Farah, you want to get started?
Yeah. I'm not sure where Olivia went to, but I'm Farah Heron. I am the author of Technology Gremlins. Yes, it always happens. So I'm the author of teen YA and adult rom-coms. My latest book is Camila Knows Best. It is a Austen retelling of Jane Austen's Emma. And then my book before that, I had a YA rom-com called Tahira in Bloom. And I'm coming to you from Toronto.
Okay. Okay. My name is I'm really excited to be here. My name is Stacey Adjern. I am from New York, but I'm actually coming to you today from Newport News, Virginia. I write contemporary romance, mostly with Jewish characters and themes. My most recent book is Love and Latkes, which came out in October of last year. My next book is called B'nai Mitzvah Mistake, and it comes out in June of 2023 from Tuli Publishing. I'm just really happy to be here.
I can go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Uzma Jalaluddin. I've written 2 novels, both of which are set in Toronto, but more specifically within a South Asian diaspora, and specifically within a Muslim community. So I tend to write rom-coms about Muslim characters. My first novel is Aisha at Last, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. And my second novel, which came out in 2021, is right behind me, Hanahan Carries On, which is You've Got Mail, but set in rival halal restaurants. And I'm thrilled to be here.
Hi, my name is Preslasa Williams. I write contemporary romance with an Afro-Filipina twist. I've been writing since 2008. My first contemporary romance novel that released in 2021 is A Low Country Bride. And my second one is forthcoming in November of this year, and it's called A Sweet Low Country Proposal. And I usually write some themes of faith, Christian themes of faith. I'm usually centered around people of African descent and Afro-Filipino descent. I usually have one character that has African-American and Filipino, but it usually talks about in the Black Christian communities, the communities that I center on.
Okay, I'm going to come back, and I think it might be okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Rosie Dannon. I am the author of The Roommate and The Intimacy Experiment, and I have upcoming work in fall of 2023, which maybe we'll get a chance to talk about at the end of the panel. Very happy to be here, and hopefully audio is okay now.
I think did we lose Olivia?
I think we lost her. Should we just dive right in?
We lost Olivia, but I can bring up her questions that she shared with
Yeah,
us.
she says she's in chat.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just search.
Or Olivia, if you want to throw the questions in chat, we could maybe try that way too.
Yeah, the video toggle, Olivia, is in there. It's kind of on the bottom left.
No idea where the video toggle went. Can do. Let's start with. She says, so let's start with talking about food, which of course I absolutely love talking about food. So I think Rosie, you were going to go first. Did you want to talk about food and faith in your books?
Oh, sure. Food has just been such an accessible connection point to Jewish tradition and identity for me. I'm personally like a patrilineal Jew, and so there's always a little bit of, am I Jewish enough for me? And that's the same with my character Naomi in the intimacy experiment. And so, but you don't have to have a certain amount of Jewish education or years of religious study to enjoy Jewish food. And so that really has been something I wanted to put on the page. And it's also a ritual that I think brings people together, makes them feel connected. There's a scene in the book where Jewish women are cooking together, and that's something that's always been really special for me and my Jewish family, and a way to just always come together and share stories. And food is sort of just like a way of sharing love, preparing food for someone, showing them you love them.
Yeah. Yeah, I know for me as well, when we're talking about diaspora immigrant communities, food is the link that we have together, especially when we're coming. I write from families of immigrant families, and I myself am the child of immigrants, and that was how we would keep our culture, because we're in a new land, and we're surrounded by people that are different from us, so we could hold tight to our culture through food. And then, like you said, Rosie, like the image of women cooking together is so strong in my childhood, and I think for all of us, we can remember that that sisterhood, that mothers and our aunts and everybody coming together and cooking. It's not just women, but so I think food is such an important part when we're talking about culture, and of course, faith and culture are so intertwined.
You're
Oh,
muted.
you're muted.
Am I back? Okay. It's interesting talking about all of this now because Farah, you, Uzma, and I had a conversation ages ago about barbecue, about halal barbecue and about kosher barbecue, and sort of like passing down, like tying into the idea of passing down, I would say, dietary laws and rules and the things that sort of we think about, that we are conscious about when we are making food and cooking. And that actually is the center focus of my last book, Love and Latkes. There's a lot of conversation about kosher, keeping kosher, and sort of the Jewish rules about it. But it also was inspired, the fact that like my hero does kosher barbecue was kind of inspired by that conversation that we had ages ago. But also tying in back to what Rosie was saying as well, this idea of there are so many moments where my family passes down these recipes, whether like they're tied into being kosher or not, whether they're just tied into holidays or not. Like it's a huge part of Jewish faith. Like every single holiday has its own dietary menu, for lack of a better conversation about it. And like people, like exactly, like you sometimes what holiday you're celebrating by what you're eating, but it's also the calendar as well. You know, this sort of like people's biggest memories of like the like Passover Seder's, for example, come from the food that we eat, and it ties into the sort of our customs and traditions. So.
When I think about A Sweet Low Country Proposal, because that book has a lot of heavier faith things in it, and I think about the connection to food and faith in that book, I would say that like food is a way for people to come together and have harder conversations. So like the food serves as like this way to like break the ice, so to speak. So you're not directly talking about the issue that is hurting you, where if I'm speaking from the point of view of the character, but it's a way to connect. There are some scenes in there where the hero Marcus, for example, he goes over to his grandmother's house, she's a pastor's wife, and she brings all this food out, and he's like, I don't eat all this food. He's like, no, eat. And during the course of that scene, deeper conversations come up about trauma, grief, past relationship breakups, and all of that. So I think that food kind of serves as like this peacemaker in a way, so that people can actually talk.
I think it's interesting, Stacey, what you were saying about dietary restrictions. So one of the things about my books is that I mostly focus on South Asian culture, and very specifically North Indian culture. So like the food of North India, for instance, is very different from the food that my husband's family, they're from South India, would eat. And so this kind of gets into the way that food oftentimes is used as a shorthand for other readers outside of that culture or that religion to feel comfortable, because it's always something that we can share, and you can try someone else's food. You're almost like trying on what their culture feels like as you eat it and take it into your body almost. But this kind of gets into the bigger conversation that I think, Olivia, you were trying to bring up about being culturally religious as opposed to, more spiritual, and getting into sort of like the practices of that faith. And I think food is a really good shorthand of how other people can kind of jump into other types of cultures. So I'm Muslim, but I'm not Arab. I'm Indian. So our food is really different from like I love Mediterranean, I love Arab food, but like hummus is not my thing. I'm more of a curry girl. And that's really interesting that I come from a country where there's, just like Canada, there's multiple faiths. But even if I'm speaking to someone from India from another faith who's maybe Hindu, we both can bond over like the type of naan that we like, or the type of samosas that we like, because we come from a similar ethnic background. But it's different from faith.
Well, I think part of what that gets to is this idea that food, and hi again, everyone, is this idea that food is both something that welcomes people home, that's familiar, but that also welcomes new people into a group, that it is something shareable. Like faith is something you have to talk out. They can be really difficult conversations. Differing beliefs need different balances. But food is a much easier form of like community building. Do any of your books feature difficulties around food? Like we talked briefly about dietary restrictions, but like, is that a source of conflict?
I mean, it can be a source of conflict, especially coming from a cultural perspective. I'm also South Asian, and unfortunately, Indian food has a reputation for being difficult and bad for your stomach and all that not true stuff. So I think that cultural clash with people about the food you grew up on. But the main difficulties so the perception, going back to what Uzma saying, is the diversity within diversity. The diversity in the Muslim world. Like I identify as a Muslim as well, but I'm quite different, and the way I eat is quite different. My family is a double diaspora. So we're coming from India, then East Africa, then Canada. So the food has changed over time. And then to feel that I'm not Indian enough or not Muslim enough because I because our culture has changed with every big migration, and because I was born in Canada, so all of those things can kind of combine. And when somebody says, "Oh, you're not really Indian because you don't do this, it's like, well, then I am me. I'm what I am, and that kind of internal conflict because of feeling not enough, is where I feel that can even happen with food as well as with religion and other cultural things.
In my book, my second novel, Hanahan, it actually takes place within two different restaurants. And so the conflict isn't that both of these restaurants serve halal food, which means that they're permissible for people who observe halal. But one of them serves kind of like American style food, so like burgers and ribs and things like that. And then the other one is more like South Asian. It's a hole in the wall South Asian diner. And so it's more of a culture clash based on sort of the way that different generations like to eat and the types of food that they like to eat. Like I still enjoy Indian food, whereas my kid, who's now, what is he, third generation, because his grandparents were from back home. He's like, I can take Indian food in very small doses. Mostly he likes typical whatever Canadian style fare would be, lots of pasta.
Speaking of generations, that's probably a great segue into our next question, which is about marriages and weddings and family customs and that difference between like generations. Like Farah, you mentioned the history of like the traditions in just a single family. So so I'm asking now, how do marriage traditions and wedding traditions factor into how you approach culture and religion in your work? Everyone, this is Rob.
Yeah, marriage is a huge bit. Weddings in South Asian cultures, like that's your biggest social event of the year. My specific culture, we do weddings big, but not as big as like a big 5-day week-long Hindu wedding. It's still a big family gathering. It's still a way to get together. It's interesting though, because I think we sometimes forget that we're writing romance, and that romance is in and itself about relationships, about family, and even, I mean, I don't write all my characters don't end up getting married at the end. They're not getting married, having babies. I write kind of varied all over the place. But at the end of the day, that is what we're writing. We're writing about relationships and families coming together. And so that wedding thing is always in the back of my head. Is like, what would the wedding look like for these two people? Because wedding's such a big part of my culture. Only in one of my books, Accidentally Engaged, it actually has a wedding at the end, and I don't want to give it away, but it is not at all what your perception of what a South Asian wedding would be, and that was intentional, that I kind of turned it on its head just so that her family would be annoyed. So that's kind of something that I'm always thinking about. How would the wedding work with these people? How would that happen? Would they even get married? Would they choose not to? So that's in my head, but it's not always something I put on the page.
So, I'm trying to think about it. Okay. So, quite a number of years ago, I read a book by Zoe Castile, Zarda Cordova, called Stripped, and it made me cry because it was the first time I had read a Jewish wedding on the page in a romance novel. I've been reading romance novels for years. I was a romance buyer, in a bookstore. Like, I've been in this industry up to my neck for years. And it was fantastic. I didn't expect to see it on the page at all. But as we got closer and closer, number one, we got to the wedding itself, and number two, we started to see some of the traditions. And I kind of, since I read that book, I was trying to figure out like what it would look like to have a Jewish wedding on the page written by a Jewish author. Like, how would this work? So, probably spoiler, my next series, Last Girl Standing, is the story is about a couple going through the wedding process. You meet them in book one, and then through the other books, you get to see their process. You get to see the ketubah getting written. You get to see the whole thing. You get to see, and then the wedding in the last book in the series. So, so I'm like doing the research for all of that now, and it's just fantastic. Like I've seen Jewish weddings. I've seen, the glass being broken. I've seen all of that. But it's exciting, like learning more about it. So from a perspective, I'm excited to sort of share that. So.
I don't have any weddings specifically on the page in the Intimacy Experiment, but I think like one sort of related theme or topic that comes up is the idea of physical intimacy for Ethan, who's my rabbi character, and whether or not he can have like intimate relations, physical intimate relations, like before marriage. And this was an opportunity for me, I think, to kind of just like address the way that there's a lot of opportunity, like a lot of rabbis have different relationships to sex. But for Ethan specifically, in this conversation with Naomi, where she's kind of like checking in with him, and it's really a conversation about consent at the end of the day. He is expressing that he personally is comfortable with like having sex before marriage, and he has had sex before. And it was funny, I had during like research for this book and stuff, I got to speak to some rabbis, and I just remember one of them being like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, like when we were in school, we were all just having a lot of sex together." And I was like, "Oh wow, okay, so like rabbis are really did going for it," and that was really exciting for me. And so yeah, it was just fun to be able to maybe like challenge some misconceptions about that potentially on the page, and I think also to make that conversation around consent actually be something that hopefully comes across as a sexy thing to talk about, which I think is also something that people don't always associate discussions about consent as being something that can actually be like a form of verbal foreplay. But that was sort of what I was trying to achieve there.
As far for me in my books with marriage, usually when I think of marriage, I think of like the traditional American type wedding, the Western white version, without any kind of differing cultural or religious traditions infused in them. So what I try to do whenever I do portray a wedding is to portray some element of culture into the wedding ceremony, whether that be for like Filipino cultural traditions where we have the aras and the cord and the coins, or an African American element with jumping the broom. That I try to do that with the weddings, because I usually like my framework, just because of how the culture that I'm infused in is just traditional white wedding. So I try to add, the cultural elements into it. As far as sex, there is none. There is none in any of my books. And it's just, for me, it's just not like on my like radar as far as like where my creativity goes. So it's not something that I just consider or write about. So I think that's just me, the author, putting my comfort level into what I write. So it's just not there. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be for other authors who may have stories with people who are Christians and they deal with issues of sexuality and things like that, especially premarital sex. It's just not something that I consider when I write my novels and I infuse a Christian worldview in them.
I like what you said about Prislesa, about bringing in other kind of cultural norms. So Stacey, like you, I've really never seen a Muslim wedding, or very little. I mean, it's getting a little bit better now, but it means something to kind of have a tradition that, personally as a South Asian woman, I've gone to like hundreds of weddings. Weddings are very much like a familial thing. Like everyone's invited. I've been going to weddings since I was a little tiny child, and I continue to do so. So when I write wedding scenes in my books, and I do tend to have like, my big fat Indian wedding in some of my books, they're oftentimes they're there because I like to write about them and they're fun and it's a romance novel. But I also like to almost like get my readers familiar with some of the terms. So like, what's a nikah? That's like the Muslim wedding. It's just a nikah. And what's a walima? That's the reception afterwards. And like some South Asian terms, like what's a rishta? It's a proposal. What is a meher? That's what we call dowry. Just kind of like using those words And hopefully people will be interested, and they'll get some context for those words. If they hear them outside in other parts of their life, they'll know what that is because they've become familiar with it. And I think the subject of intimacy is really interesting too. Both of my books have not had any sex in them either. Though the sensuality in romance is definitely implied. Like, I'm still writing very much a love story, and there's a lot of different types of intimacy that kind of appears on the page when I kind of craft these stories. I have to say, I think it is sometimes a little challenging to be a romance writer and to not write explicitly about sex, but then what's happened for me is that oftentimes my books, even though they're very much adult, sometimes they get lumped in with YA, which I think is really interesting. Not to say that YA books don't have sex in them, but they certainly don't have as explicit, as far as I know, sex as some of the more erotic romances that I read and enjoy. So I'm not opposed to any sex on the page. I also just haven't done it yet.
But Uzma, I do want to point out your first book. I haven't read Hana Khan yet. I've been saving it. It's one of my emergency books. But the first book deals very frankly with issues of sexual consent. Like, you depict because it's a Pride and Prejudice retelling, and you have the Wickham character, who's usually pretty dastardly, but like in yours is like extra modern dastardly. How does that factor in from like a cultural and a traditional standpoint? Like, the idea of normally what we'd think of as like, he's a threat because he's flirtatious and attractive, but you framed that in a bit of a different way. Can I ask you about that?
Yeah, for sure. So my Wickham character is actually, and I think in the original he's like this as well. He's basically a sexual predator. He takes advantage of young women, just like Wickham did. Like, I think Jane Austen was all but implying that he was the original Wickham had almost like pedophilia tendencies, right? Because he lured and took advantage of underage girls, right? Even during that time, it would have been considered something really terrible. And so my Wickham character, he kind of has this relationship with, okay, spoiler alert, the book is 4 years old, with a significant character's sister. And then as the book progresses in Jane Austen Pride and Prejudice fashion, he has a relationship with the main character's younger cousin, who's naive and impressionable. And he actually, I don't want to ruin it, but just, basically does something without consent. It's not sexual assault, but it is... he takes pictures of her and basically extorts her. And I really wanted to get at the heart of the fact that, Muslim men are capable of great kindness and being vulnerable and being very respectful the way that Khalid is. But just like any other man in the world, there are some people who are just jerks. And the Wickham character is kind of that trope. And I wanted to show that the way that in this particular community, the idea of shame, but also it's wrong when this happens to anyone. And it's not because it's wrong because this happened to a hijab wearing young woman, but it happened to a woman without her consent. That's where the shame comes from, the terribleness comes from. And her family doesn't do something like gross and what I think is always really stereotypical. And like, I don't know, none of my friends, their families aren't like this. They don't disown her and they don't say, oh, you've dishonored the family. They put the blame where the blame is supposed to be, with the guy who did the thing, who took these pictures. Maybe she was young and she was impressionable and she was naive and she trusted someone who she shouldn't have because she's a young girl, but he's the one who did the thing that was wrong. And so they basically track him down and make him pay, which is awesome.
And then I remember you also have Khaled, who is a very like traditional Muslim man in so many ways. And like, I love how that feeds into like the Darcy stoicness in a really interesting way, but also he's building websites for like a lingerie company. And it's like, he's like, oh no, but this is perfectly fine. These women are very good business partners. He doesn't have a problem with it at all. And it really makes it a stark contrast. And I still love that, like years later.
Thank you. Well, I think it comes down to maybe some of the things that the other authors have also struggled with, which is that how can our characters, and maybe by extension, some of us as well, exist in this world where we kind of have multiple perspectives in our mind all the time, right? So like Khalid is like, he's very devout, he's very observant. In the beginning of the book, he doesn't even shake hands with women because he grew up in this sort of place where, in his mind, and whether we agree with this or not is up to us, he thinks touching a woman who's not his wife is disrespectful. That's just the way that he was raised, you know. And I personally don't. I think that's a little bit extra, but that's Khalid, right? But at the same time, he thinks that women should feel beautiful, and why shouldn't women of all shapes and sizes be able to buy lingerie and make themselves feel attractive? And he's totally. This is the thing. He looks like what stereotypes have said is a misogynistic man because he has a long beard and he won't shake a woman's hand. But he's actually really, in his heart, he's a bit of a feminist. It's expressed in a different way. And that's kind of what I was trying to play with in my book. And I know the rest of you have done the same thing. I'd love to hear about it too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like playing with contrast is definitely something that I've tried to do with Ethan, again, as a rabbi, like how I think there's people that would question how can someone be like a religious leader? How can they command respect in a community? And then how can they also, have like dirty talk with their intimate partner? Like, can those two things coexist? And I hope that I have shown that they can. And at the end of the day, it's all about showing that these are whole people, right? They have different dimensions, just like any of us. They have different ways of interacting the same way. Again, the same way I go to work and I act differently at work than I do, on a romance panel or with my girlfriends or whatever. And I think it's just really important especially when it's a religious figure that maybe doesn't get as much like media representation. I don't know that there's like a ton of people who have seen a lot of media with rabbis. And media really shapes our perceptions of communities. And so just trying to add a dimensionalized, very human character that is able to balance responsibilities and, passion and commitment for a partner is something that I was excited about that opportunity. And I hope that the dualities like exist on the page in a way that is fun and like creates excitement because you want to get to know that person.
I'm thinking of in a Sweet Low Country Proposal, we're talking about like sensuality and desire. The hero and the heroine in that story, Marcus and Jasleen, are sitting in a Black Protestant church, and they're in the middle of like church service, and he's looking at her, the love interest, and he's just feeling all of this desire towards her while his grandfather's preaching, and everyone's, oh, amen, brother, preach it, and he's just feeling all this like desire, towards her during church. And there's this line in the story where I'm just paraphrasing, where he says, when I was growing up, my grandfather always told me that desire was dangerous. But if it was so dangerous, why did this feel so very honest? And so I kind of have that duality also, where you're in this traditional Black Protestant Christianity, which is very, traditional as far as like sexuality and views on sexuality. But here he is in the middle of this religious ritual, and he's just feeling these feelings towards her. And he's kind of struggling with what he was taught versus what he's feeling and what he's interpreting, what he's feeling as honest. Not to say that his grandfather is dishonest, but he's just feeling that duality and that struggle. So I played with it a little bit.
I really love that, Prislesa. That quote you just did was very beautiful. I think I came at it a bit of a different angle. I wasn't, my characters for the most part are not super religious, but they're in a more religious community. In Camilla Knows Best, one of the things that Camilla is struggling with is her late mother was very judgmental about her. with her, which is unfortunately not uncommon in my culture. Judgmental about her, about Camilla's sexuality, about her, basically about the way she dresses, about the way she flirts with men, all of these things. She had an abusive childhood, mostly coming from her mother. Her mother's is passed away now, so that's something that she very tells the world that she's been through years and years of therapy, and that's why she's standing straight now. But you can see that it's something that it kind of knocks into her every once in a while, this duality of can she be a member of her culture when she lives the life she lives. And it's something that she has overcome, and she has figured out how to do it, but that trauma is still there. The way that she was raised with a judgmental mother, and all of the aunties on her all the time about the way that she chose to live her life with regards to not just sex, but with regards to everything. And I think that's something that's quite common, that younger generations, people that are not overly religious, but still a member of the community, and still a child of those parents. That's something that you kind of have to figure out. Like, can I be in this culture if I don't take all of it? Can I be in this culture when some people's interpretation of the culture doesn't approve of me? Or where can I find my place in it? Camilla's place in it is that she loves Indian food. She's always supporting her family. She's incredibly, she's living a very traditional South Asian family dynamic, where all the aunties and uncles are super important to her. She takes care of her father. So she is in her culture, even though has that struggle about whether she is enough. And so I think that for me, it's important for me to show that not every South Asian, not every Muslim family looks the same, because they don't. They're incredibly different. But also that even within a family, people can be very different and still be part of that culture.
So I'm going to take it back, tying a couple of things together. I'm going to talk about History of Us, because a lot of that book is about legacy, and about making the world better, and about community and culture in a lot of ways. And actually, Rosie, hearing about the intimacy experiment was something that kind of opened the door for me. In Miracles and Menorahs, which was my first book, there is no rabbi on the page. There is a synagogue. There's obvious evidence of a Jewish community in the town, but there are no clergy. And it was because mentally it was a barrier that when I was writing the book, I couldn't break. I couldn't do it. I couldn't make that step. But knowing, Rosie, that you were writing the intimacy experiment and having a rabbi on the page as a main male character in a story made me lose it in the best of ways. And it allowed me to take that step and write a rabbi character on the page in History of Us. No services. Services actually don't show up until B'nai Mitzvah, which there are a lot of services in that book, but that's another story entirely. But sort of showing the center of that spiritual life in History of Us was something it was a nice kind of step for me that I could not have done without Intimacy Experiment. So that said, the other things about this book and about family legacy and about duality leads me right to Jacob, the hero of History of Us. His legacy is complicated, and he fundamentally feels like he needs to fix his father's mistakes. He's always felt like he's had to fix his father's mistakes. He feels like he's got this huge, heavy burden on his shoulders 90% of the time in his life. And but part of that ties into his relationship with Anna, who has seen him at his best, who has seen him at his worst. They're not necessarily the best together. They have to figure themselves out, which is why they are at the stage that they are when History of Us starts. But as these characters come to terms with not only their place in the community, but their place in themselves, which is something that both of them have to do. Anna wants to find her place in both her profession and her community, and Jacob wants to make a place for himself. And generally speaking, he wants to find something that fulfills him, sort of professionally and personally, and sort of so he doesn't feel like he's chasing this elusive idea of making the world better, the idea of Tikkun Olam. And it's actually going back to what you were saying, Uzma, about terms as well. I like to put some Hebrew and some Yiddish terminology in my books because these principles are important, and I think like you hear them in generally in the world, and I feel like you can put them in the books too. So, but yeah, so it's this. Tying this idea of duality and legacy and all of these things together, and that's kind of the core of history in a lot of ways. So.
I wanted to echo quickly because I know you have a short time. Stacy was saying about how she felt this block about putting like a rabbi in a synagogue and very Jewish elements into her story. I had the same block, especially with this book, A Sweet Low Country Proposal, because I just had like, references to church, pastor's wife as side characters. And I remember like someone read like a very, very early draft, and then they sent me this email and they were like, is this Christian fiction? And I was just like, I don't know if this is Christian fiction. And I was like, do I want this to be Christian fiction? I was like, no, it's just that I have these elements in there, but maybe it is, I don't know. And like when she asked me, because I guess she's trying to figure out like, what's the genre? I was like, I don't know, maybe, yeah. But then I have my own blocks about, the Christian fiction genre so I was just kind of like, I don't know, maybe. But yeah, I felt the same way with my stuff, Stacy.
Isn't it interesting the way that we're all kind of inspiring each other and almost like making a path, right? Because I know when I wrote Aisha at Last, and it wasn't that long ago, 2018, a lot of people said they'd never seen like practicing Muslims on the page before. And whether they were observant or not, it was just, the idea of like someone like Khalid who dresses the way he does. He's always the villain in other movies, but he's like the sexy main character in mine. I was like, did I make beards hot again? Is that something that I can take credit for? Maybe, I don't know. But it's hard to kind of be out there because you don't really have anything to look up to, right? So like all of us come from communities where maybe we have there's Muslim fiction, right? But it's, when I first started writing, I had a comment from a family friend who was like, oh, are you going to sell it in like the community bookstore? Is that because that was where Muslim romance belonged, right? Like in a little tiny community bookstore where I would photocopy it and give copies of my book to people at Friday prayers. And I was like, no, I'm going to sell it in like my beloved local indie. I'm going to sell it everywhere, hopefully. It's hard though sometimes. We're kind of making up the rules as we go.
Yeah,
I think.
Sorry. I think making up the rules along is exactly right. I also struggled with how much religious elements to put in my books, especially since my characters are not very devout. So I don't want people picking up my book and think that they're going to get a very observant Muslim. But at the same time, I also don't want to put aside my own culture, and I want to write cultural stories. That is what I want. So I struggled. And I remember with my first book, it wasn't until I think the second edit that I actually put the specific names of things on the page of the prayer hall of what they like. I was very vague, and it was all like vaguely Indian kind of Muslim until I was like, no, and then I got brave. I'm like, no, this is going to go with specificity. That's a hard word. With specificity, exactly what I was talking about. And I kind of like ducked. I put the book out and I expected people to get angry because there was nothing else before that. There was none. So how much of this religious element can you put on there without somebody having expectations of the book? And it was a struggle, and I'm glad I'm doing it now. But yeah, I really hope I hope there's more. I hope there's lots and lots of different cultural and religious elements people are putting in their books more and more.
So
Well, I
guess
think I could go for another hour, I swear, but I think we have to cut off right now. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This was absolutely fantastic. One of the best discussions I have seen in a long time. For everyone, thank you for joining us, participants and audience. And remember to order the books from the bookshop link, which I think you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And hopefully you're checking in with other Bookstore Romance Day events later on. I know there's some wonderful things happening. I know there's a couple of queer panels. I know that there's a couple of historical romance things happening. And again, thank you so much to our panelists. I really appreciate the time you took, and thank you. A shout out to Christine, who fixed our technical issues. And I hope everyone else has a wonderful end to their day. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.